Her Majesty the Queen has asked me to form a new government, and I have accepted. I aim to form a proper and full coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats.
Britain's new Prime Minister, David Cameron, has moved into number 10 tonight to form his new government. He takes office 5 days after the election, promising a new start, but also paying tribute to the service of his predecessor. After 13 years in Downing Street, 3 as Prime Minister, Gordon Brown resigned, admitting responsibility for Labour's defeat.
It was a privilege to serve, and yes, I loved the job, not for its prestige, its titles and its ceremony, which I do not love at all. No, I loved the job for its potential to make this country I love fairer, more tolerant, more green, more democratic, more prosperous and more just. Truly a greater Britain.
Mr. Brown said goodbye to Downing Street with his wife and 2 young sons and headed home to Scotland. For Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats, their party's first taste of real power beckons after more than 70 years.
And on BBC London, what will a Conservative Lib Dem coalition mean for people in the capital? And the traffic camera that's netted nearly £1 million a month in fines.
Very good evening from number 10 Downing Street, where David Cameron arrived this evening to take up residence as Britain's new Prime Minister. The Conservative leader had come from Buckingham Palace, where he'd been invited by the Queen to form a new government. Gordon Brown had tendered his resignation a little earlier. Mr. Cameron, the 12th Prime Minister of the Queen's reign, takes office after 5 days of talks on forming a government with Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats. First tonight, our political editor Nick Robinson on the day's historic events.
You thought it was all over? It is now. Gordon Brown didn't wait for his rivals to do a deal. He resigned tonight when it was clear that his audacious bid to stay in power and create what he called a progressive coalition had failed.
As you know, the general election left no party able to command a majority in the House of Commons. I said I would do all that I could to ensure a strong, stable and principled government was formed, able to tackle Britain's economic and political challenges effectively. My constitutional duty is to make sure that a government can be formed following last Thursday's general election. I've informed the Queen's private secretary that it's my intention to tender my resignation to the Queen. In the event that the Queen accepts, I shall advise her to invite the Leader of the Opposition to seek to form a government. I wish the next Prime Minister well as he makes the important choices for the future. Only those who have held the office of Prime Minister can understand the full weight of its responsibilities and its great capacity for good. I have been privileged to learn much about the very best in human nature, and a fair amount too about its frailties, including my own. My resignation as leader of the Labour Party will take effect immediately. And in this hour, I want to thank all my colleagues, ministers, members of Parliament, and I want to thank above all my staff, who have been friends as well as brilliant servants of the country. Above all, I want to thank Sarah for her unwavering support as well as her love, and for her own service to our country. I thank my sons, John and Fraser, for the love and joy they bring to our lives. And as I leave the second most important job I could ever hold, I cherish even more the first, as a husband and father. Thank you, and goodbye.
And with that, he and New Labour took their leave of Downing Street 13 years after they moved in. But not before the Browns, all of them, young John and Fraser too, faced the cameras together for the very first time, before travelling in Daddy's official car to go to see the Queen, to explain that it was time for someone else to have a turn at running the country. Following them out of the door, Alistair Campbell and other faces and names of the Brown years, Ed Balls, Ed Miliband, future leaders perhaps. At Labour HQ, Gordon Brown made clear he was resigning immediately as Labour leader. Harriet Harman will take his place until a successor is elected. And he took responsibility for an election failure.
And I have to accept and indeed assert personal responsibility. The fault is mine, and I will carry that alone.
As the sun set on one political era, a new one began, with the arrival at Buckingham Palace of the man about to become our youngest Prime Minister in nearly 200 years. This, the first ever image of a monarch inviting one of her subjects to form a new administration. This was the journey which David and Samantha Cameron had for so long dreamt of, talked about, and this week begun to wonder if they'd ever make. The journey to the most famous address in the world, and to power. Not for him, though, the sunshine and optimism of Tony Blair's first day in office. By now it was dark and cold. His first words as Prime Minister, a warning about difficult times to come.
Her Majesty the Queen has asked me to form a new government, and I have accepted. Before I talk about that new government, let me say something about the one that has just passed. Compared with a decade ago, this country is more open at home and more compassionate abroad, and that is something we should all be grateful for. And on behalf of the whole country, I'd like to pay tribute to the outgoing Prime Minister for his long record of dedicated public service. In terms of the future, our country has a hung parliament where no party has an overall majority, and we have some deep and pressing problems, a huge deficit, deep social problems, and a political system in need of reform. For those reasons, I aim to form a proper and full coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. I believe that is the right way to provide this country with the strong, the stable, the good and decent government that I think we need so badly. Nick Clegg and I are both political leaders who want to put aside party differences and work hard for the common good and for the national interest. I believe that is the best way to get the strong government that we need, decisive government that we need today.
By now, Downing Street was a Labour-free zone. The waiting faces and names ones will soon get to know. There too, civil servants whose allegiance must switch in an instant.
Real change is not what government can do on its own. Real change is when everyone pulls together, comes together, works together, when we all exercise our responsibilities to ourselves, to our families, to our communities, and to others. And I want to help try and build a more responsible society here in Britain. One where we don't just ask, what are my entitlements, but what are my responsibilities? This is going to be hard and difficult work. A coalition will throw up all sorts of challenges, but I believe together we can provide that strong and stable government that our country needs, based on those values, rebuilding family, rebuilding community, above all, rebuilding responsibility in our country. Those are the things I care about. Those are the things that this government will now start work on doing. Thank you very much.
And so begin the Cameron years. With a new party in power, a new coalition too, provided Nick Clegg can persuade his party to back it, and a new promise to face up to big challenges, confront problems and take difficult decisions. They may be happy tonight, but 5 days after the election, with the haggling finally over, David Cameron's already learnt that power is never easy. Nick Robinson, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, tonight's rapid succession of events took place after lengthy negotiations between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats on trying to form a new government following that inconclusive result of last week's election. And the negotiating teams reported back to their parliamentary colleagues tonight and then presented their recommendations to them. James Landale reports now on what that deal could involve.
Two men, two parties, and now for the first time in 70 years, the prospect of one coalition government between them. This evening, as talks between both sides ended, not all the detail had been agreed, but the mood music was positive.
We've completed our discussions discussions in a very positive atmosphere. We now have some recommendations to take back to David Cameron and to our parliamentary colleagues, the Conservative MPs.
Mr. Laws, is it a full coalition? Can you tell us?
It's a report back and then a decision.
But are you
Tonight, both sides are still consulting their parties. But what's the shape of the government that's emerging? Well, there may be some Lib Dems around the cabinet table, the first since the Second World War. Alongside David Cameron, the Chancellor George Osborne and Michael Gove, there could be Nick Clegg and the likes of Chris Huhne and maybe Vince Cable.
It's all very difficult, all very fragile, but it might well work if the overhang of the national debt and the perilous economic position continues to concentrate minds.
But what about policy? What will this new government do? Well, Tory sources are making clear they'll start cutting spending sooner rather than later. But plans for inheritance tax cuts may be on hold, while the Lib Dem proposals to cut income tax on pay of up to £10,000 will be a priority. There are also plans for fixed-term parliaments and a referendum on a new way of voting that allows people to rank candidates in order of preference. But how can a coalition work? How can Conservatives like Michael Gove and Lib Dems like Simon Hughes coexist when they're divided so much by policy and by culture?
There has historically been a great difference between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats over Europe and over immigration. It is absolutely essential that the red lines established during the negotiations remain absolutely firm.
Tonight, a coalition that will command the confidence of the House of Commons is being formed. But key questions remain. How long will it last? Will it remain united? And does it have the internal strength to face the challenges ahead? James Landau, BBC News, Westminster.
With me now, our political editor, Nick Robinson. And Nick, we stood here last night. It was by no means clear that David Cameron would get to number 10. Things have moved at a great speed.
It's been an extraordinary 24 hours for him. When he went home last night, David Cameron must briefly have thought, this is not going to happen. The Labour Party had made that offer. Gordon Brown had offered to resign. The Liberal Democrats, excited, many of them, at the prospect of what they saw as a progressive alliance. But as dawn broke this morning, it was clear that many Liberal Democrats were unhappy with the deal that had been offered. They didn't think they got the details from Labour that they were getting from the Tories, and gradually the confidence of the Conservatives increased. But even tonight, up until minutes before Gordon Brown resigned, I was in this street. Still, they were talking just down the road, trying to do a deal. Nothing certain. And then Gordon Brown, took them all by surprise by suddenly ringing up and saying, I'm going to resign now. I don't care that a deal's not been done. I'm off. And David Cameron finds himself here. He'll be delighted, but the very first thing he has to do is to leave that famous building to go and brief his own MPs on the deal he's done.
Well, one of the first things he mentioned on the doorstep was the fact that he wanted to enter a proper, meaningful coalition, not a loose arrangement, a proper coalition with the Lib Dems. Do we know a lot more about that tonight?
The answer is no. We know the words proper and meaningful and coalition, really, Hugh. What we know is, as we speak, Nick Clegg is selling the details of that plan to his own parliamentary party and his own party's executive, and he needs 75% of their support to make it happen. David Cameron went from here to sell it to his MPs. We know certain things. We know William Hague, as we expected, will be our next Foreign Secretary, that George Osborne will be our next Chancellor, and we know one vital example of the sorts of policy changes the Liberal Democrats have demanded. They have persuaded the Conservatives to abandon plans to cut inheritance tax, to use the money instead for the Liberal Democrats' tax priority, to increase the tax thresholds for people, which will happen in a first Tory budget. But the Tories have got their way on one vital thing that was a key part of the election. There will be those £6 billion of cuts in this year as a down payment, they say, to deal with the deficit.
Nick, we'll talk a little more later on, but for now, thank you very much. Nick Robinson there. Well, David Cameron comes to number 10 with no ministerial experience, as did Tony Blair back in 1997. But Mr Cameron now replaces Mr Blair as the youngest British Prime Minister since Lord Liverpool back in 1812. Mr Cameron, an old Etonian, entered the House of Commons 9 years ago, became Conservative leader just 4 years later. His leadership has been dominated by efforts to modernise his party. Our political correspondent, Rita Chakrabarti, looks at the kind of premiership we're likely to see.
David Cameron's victory wasn't easy. His election campaign provided catchy images,
That is really good. Thank you very much.
With the occasional unscripted encounter.
Yeah, so how are you going to fix it? How are you going to make it easier for children to get to mainstream schools?
None of this can have prepared him for the last few days. But tonight, one veteran said he was destined for the top.
He's a straight guy, he's very clever, he's totally devoted to politics. Indeed, I happen to know that when he was very young, he was nicknamed the Prime Minister because he always took politics very seriously, always saw it as his career.
David Cameron leapt to prominence after the Tories' third election defeat in 8 years.
I want people to feel good about being Conservatives again.
His fluent, no-note speech to the party conference in 2005 was designed to portray him as a modern, moderate Conservative.
134,446.
It paid off. David Cameron won the party leadership with more than twice as many votes as his rival David Davis. He ushered in a new style with hoodies and huskies and speeches about sunshine and general well-being. And he succeeded in changing the party with more women and ethnic minority MPs.
I'm not going to bed till 9 tonight, so I've got to go to bed.
And he let the cameras into his kitchen, giving the media access to his private life, saying his family was part of who he was. His first child, Ivan, was severely disabled, and Mr Cameron has spoken repeatedly of his debt to the NHS for the care it provided. Ivan died in February 2009, aged just 6. Politically, the party's fortunes rose. Boris Johnson was elected Tory Mayor of London, but he, as well as 18 members of Mr Cameron's first front bench, were from his former school, Eton, leading to charges of elitism. The party scored a palpable hit in 2007, when, with Gordon Brown toying with the idea of holding a general election, the Shadow Chancellor thrilled the autumn conference with a pledge on inheritance tax.
The next Conservative government will raise the inheritance tax threshold to £1 million.
But the MP's expenses scandal was to hit the Tories hard. The claims for duck houses and moats exposed them to anger and ridicule. David Cameron himself had to repay money for clearing wisteria from his chimney.
Hi there, hi, hello, hi, good to see you, very good to see you.
Still, the election announcement saw him the favourite to win. And he unveiled his campaign's secret weapon, his wife Samantha. But the leaders' debates changed the game, and after a middling first performance by David Cameron, the party warned, ironically now, of the dangers of a hung parliament.
A vote for any party other than the Conservatives should do the job.
David Cameron didn't get the clear mandate he wanted, but he got the top job, with all the responsibility that brings. Rita Chakrabarti, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, right now, Mr Cameron and his wife are over in the Palace of Westminster, meeting some of Mr Cameron's parliamentary colleagues, and our correspondent Carol Walker has been monitoring events there. Carol, what kind of reception did Mr Cameron have?
Well, Hugh, he was cheered to the rafters of the packed committee room upstairs as he arrived with his wife Sam a short time ago. And there was more applause as the meeting got underway. But he is, as we speak, spelling out the details of the deal that led to the coalition that got him into Downing Street. And we already know that some members of his own party are concerned that he's paid too high a price to get into Downing Street. So he's giving us all of the details on the taxation, on public spending, on education, and of course on political reform. Of course, for the time being at least, there will be huge pressure on all Conservative MPs in the early days of this new government to show discipline and support for their new Conservative Prime Minister and his Liberal Democrat partners.
Carol, thank you very much. Now, Carol Walker there in the Houses of Parliament. That's the Conservative response. For the Lib Dems, who haven't had a strong presence in government for more than 70 years, today could well be the realisation of a dream. Successive leaders have held out the hope of taking office. Those hopes have been repeatedly dashed. But tonight, after less than 3 years in the job, party leader Nick Clegg seems poised to fulfil that ambition. Peter Hunt has this assessment of Mr Clegg's leadership, and the report does contain some flash photography.
Once he'd have passed unnoticed in the street. His name didn't trip off the tongue. The leader of the third party struggled to be heard. Not anymore. Primetime television gave him national exposure. He seized it and exploited it.
So don't let them tell you that the only choice is between two old parties who've been playing pass the parcel with your government for 65 years now, making the same promises, breaking the same promises, making the same old mistakes over and over again.
So who is this self-styled political outsider? Married to Miriam, a Spanish lawyer, with a mother who was in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, Nick Clegg's had what he calls an affluent upbringing. Educated at an exclusive public school, he was guided on his career path by those on the inside.
I will try and be brief on what is actually a rather complex topic in which
Two Tory peers helped him in Europe. He was first a bureaucrat, later an MEP.
This House is able to...
He arrived in Westminster after leaving this chamber just 5 years ago.
And I therefore declare that Nick Clegg is elected leader of the Liberal Democrats.
Not long after, the young Turk became the young leader, the Lib Dems having ditched one with a drink problem and another who was judged to be too old.
So I'm Nick Clegg, and I've just got to get used to this. I'm the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Nick Clegg!
In the bear pit atmosphere of the House of Commons, he didn't have much luck getting his point across.
Look, you can shout as much as you like, it doesn't change the facts.
And he faced some opposition in his own party when he shelved a cherished Lib Dem promise to axe tuition fees. As leader, Nick Clegg's mistakes have included this magazine interview discussing his sex life. One of his successes was to be the first party leader to get on the right side of Joanna Lumley and support her Gurkha campaign. And he broke with convention to call for the Speaker, Michael Martin, to go over the expenses scandal. His own claims included for a gardener and a cake tin. He began the election with Vince Cable by his side.
I think this is a really exciting opportunity, this election, for us to do something different.
He only emerged from the shadow of the older man as the telegenic leader at the TV debates. At first, his opponent's response was flattery.
I agree with Nick. I agree with Nick. You see, I agree with Nick.
In the end, despite all the hype and the expectation, the Lib Dem election results were a big disappointment for the party. They ended up with fewer seats than before.
We simply haven't achieved what we had hoped.
It was a setback, but not for long. A hung parliament offered this man a historic opportunity and thrust him into a role he'd insisted he didn't want to occupy. Nick Clegg has become the kingmaker. Peter Hunt, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, Mr Clegg has also been meeting some of his parliamentary colleagues tonight. They're meeting not at the Houses of Parliament, but at a building in Smith Square in Westminster. Mike Sargent is there for us. Mike, what's he had to say?
Nothing on the way in, but after 5 long days of meetings, this is the last one. This is the final hurdle. Right now, Nick Clegg and his negotiators are briefing their MPs and the members of the party's federal executive about the terms of the deal and possibly the cabinet jobs that have been offered. All the indications are that the party is ready to wave this through. In theory, they need a 3/4 majority for it to be approved. It doesn't look like that's going to be a problem. It'd be extraordinary if the Liberal Democrats pulled the plug on this at this stage, but we'll find out within the hour.
Mike, thanks very much. Mike Sargent there with the Liberal Democrats. There'll be more from Downing Street a little later. Now it's back to you, Fiona.
Hugh, thanks very much. Well, the biggest challenge for David Cameron, as he indicated on the steps of Number 10, will be the economy. During the election campaign, the Conservatives said they would start cutting public spending immediately in order to bring the deficit under control. I'm joined in the studio now by our economics editor, Stephanie Flanders. There were differences, weren't there, Stephanie, how the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats said they were going to tackle the deficit. So how are they going to work together on this?
I think a lot of voters will be asking that, because in the big rhetorical debate of the campaign, as you suggest, whether or not to cut borrowing dramatically this year, they were on opposite sides. But I think, as we always said, that difference of rhetoric was much bigger than the difference in reality, and it actually came down to the fact that the Conservatives were saying they wanted to cut spending by an extra £6 billion this year, which is only 0.5% of national income. It compares to a deficit of over £160 billion. Now, they've said that they won't budge on that commitment. It's important, they think, for their standing with the financial markets, and clearly the Liberal Democrats, we know, have decided to swallow it. And I think they've decided to swallow it partly because they've got a concession that if there's a big weakening in the economy, it won't be implemented in full, but crucially because there has been this ground given on the question of raising the income tax threshold. In fact, this government is going to, apparently, have as an aspiration increasing the income tax threshold to £10,000, which was a very big goal of the Liberal Democrats. And they'll be making a down payment on that very expensive promise next year, in part, I've heard, by changing the way that they avoid Labour's so-called jobs tax. They're going to try to do that more by raising the income tax threshold than by increasing the rate at which you pay national insurance. It could, in the end, look rather cosmetic, but it was clearly important to the Liberal Democrats.
OK, Steffi Flanders, thanks very much. Just minutes after he walked into number 10 as Prime Minister, David Cameron received a call from the US President Barack Obama to congratulate him. Let's talk to our North America editor, Mark Mardell. Mark, what have you been able to find out about what the two men had to say?
Well, first of all, the President congratulated the Prime Minister on his campaign and on getting the job, but then he moved quickly on to talk about the special relationship, saying that he had a deep and personal commitment to that relationship and that the USA had no closer friend and ally than the UK, and importantly that that had thrived in the past across party boundaries. He then went on to invite the new Prime Minister to Washington in July, pretty quickly really, and they've also talked about Iran and Afghanistan and the global economy. But this White House isn't just about winners, you know. Gordon Brown can expect a nice phone call too within the next 10 minutes or so.
Okay, Mark Mardell in Washington, thanks very much. A brief look at today's other news now. The Icelandic ash cloud is causing more disruption to air travel, with 5 Moroccan airports closed for the first time since the volcano began erupting in March. Airports in the Canary Islands and southern Spain have also been closed. England coach Fabio Capello has made several surprise selections in his preliminary 30-man World Cup squad. There are places for the Tottenham defenders Ledley King and Michael Dawson. There's also a place for the Liverpool defender Jamie Carragher, who Capello tempted out of international retirement. The final 23-man squad will be announced in June. Football's world governing body FIFA has admitted that it's given South Africa a last-minute injection of money to increase its World Cup budget by 25% to ensure the tournament begins on time. With just a month to go, FIFA said that recent ticketing problems had been overcome and it was confident the World Cup would be a success. Our sports editor David Bond reports from South Africa.
This is the vision South Africa wants us all to see when the World Cup kicks off next month. Greenpoint Stadium in Cape Town, one of 10 gleaming monuments to the country's new confidence as it prepares to stage Africa's showpiece. To ensure the 2010 hosts were ready, FIFA recently had to inject an extra 25% into the budget. But the man in charge says this World Cup will still break all records for making money.
Yes, it's a lot of money, but again, just to be clear, I mean, we are not sitting on profit, because we are not making any profit. All the money, 85% of what we are making, is going back to football.
A small amount of the £2.1 billion which FIFA will make from television and sponsorship at this World Cup is being invested at centres like this one here in the Khayelitsha township.